So term limits are monumental when it comes to the rules of the game that really change the legislature. There's nothing more influential than term limits has been for the last 30 years. Now, when term limits came in, they had really good goals. They wanted to remove entrenched politicians that had been there too long, bring in new blood. The idea was that you would have a citizens' legislature, this really short term, so you'd have regular people come and go back to their real job after they were done. So these are all the goals. Now, California did not come up with this on its own, and in fact, it's one of the first well-funded efforts across the country. Kind of, we've seen immigration laws that have been copied and pasted into state legislature, abortion laws that have been copied and pasted into state legislature. And this was really one of the first. The Koch brothers funded term limits throughout the country. And it was really a target to Congress. By 1992, Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives for almost 40 years. And so there's a big wave. Republicans are trying to change the rules to make Democrats have term limits in the House. Eventually, in 1994, there's the Republican Revolution that happens where huge numbers of Republicans actually, for the first time since the 1950s, take control of the House of Representatives. So this is sort of all this wave that's starting to crest. So state legislatures were part of the plan, but really not the main target. However, after all of these states had passed term limits for Congress, including California, the Supreme Court knocked it down. So if you look at all these 23 states that term limited how long Congress could serve, and a bunch of them did their state legislature, including California, and we're still in effect. So you see the map, kind of how this is happening. And much like a lot of the progressive reforms that we saw, it's mainly in the West. The East Coast that's done the same thing for, 200 years is less likely to be sort of persuaded by a fad. But California likes to try new things, and a lot of these other states did as well. So it was a big national trend that was happening. However, the Supreme Court overruled it, and rightfully so. You can't just make this change by law, and look at what the effect would have been. Half of the country would have had congressmen with term limits, but the other half wouldn't. And that would have been really detrimental because, Virginia would still have people who are serving for 40 or 50 years, while California might only let them serve for 8 years, and Washington might let them serve for 10 years. Well, Congress is based on seniority. So all of these states that term limit their own representatives really would have been limiting the power that they had in Congress. And so the Supreme Court said, listen, you can't do this through a state legislation. That has to be a constitutional amendment to make it fair, to make it affect everyone, just like we had the 22nd Amendment, which limited the number of years and terms that a president could serve. So it's not that this is illegal. It's not that it violates the Constitution. It's just you have to do it the right way. So constitutional amendment was proposed, but it failed. By the time the constitutional amendment was being proposed, a lot of these states had had term limits start to go into effect, and we were starting to see that there were some negative impacts. So term limits were going to be a tough sell for a lot of these states that had already passed them because there were some negative impacts they were starting to see. So let's talk about California. So California, Proposition 140, again, this is an initiative, so it's going to be hard to change. You're going to have another initiative to change it. It limits the number of terms a person can serve, and really the target was Willie Brown. He was demonized, and one of the real reasons was he had been in control for so long. The reality of California's safe seats, the way the districts were drawn, it was almost impossible to defeat somebody through the election because, you had districts that were 72% Democrat. Well, a Republican's not going to be able to win that seat. So they thought that with term limits, at least, you could get some of these entrenched politicians out, and it would be easier to win. However, since safe seats remained, we didn't do anything to fix that until 2011. Term limits remained just kind of to replace one conservative Republican with another, and replace one liberal Democrat with another liberal Democrat. The problem is that we replace people with experience and institutional memory with brand new people. Now, new people aren't always a bad idea, as we'll find out. So Speaker Willie Brown had been there. He was Speaker from 1980 to 1995, and he is one of the classic personalities of California. There's a few, speakers that just really stand out. Jesse Unruh is one. If you go to Sacramento, you'll see the Jesse Unruh room. He's infamous for saying things like money is the mother's milk of politics, and more crudely, he was responding to a criticism that he was taking money from lobbyists, and he said, if you can't take their money and eat their food and have interesting conversation with their women, that's not what he said, and vote against them the next day, you have no business being in politics. And basically he was saying, they're going to buy me dinner, and they're going to buy me women, and they're going to donate to my campaign, and I may or may not do anything for them. So he's this huge figure, and Willie Brown as well. He's the longest serving speaker. He was there for 15 years, and without term limits, he might still be there. But he dominated the legislature, and really was an easy target for term limits, because people were like, Willie Brown is never going to leave. The only way we can do this is with term limits. And Willie Brown kind of reveled in it. He called himself the Ayatollah of the assembly. So they called him a brilliant daycare operator, because it was sort of like all the members of the assembly were his kids, and he manipulated them and corralled them and controlled them. So he made himself a big target, and clearly he was, because he was so incredibly powerful. So Prop 140 passes. It limits the executive branch to 2 terms, which really wasn't a problem, but we limit the executive branch. We limit the California Senate to 2 terms of 8 years, and the California Assembly to 3 terms of 6 years. So that really severely limits how long a member of the legislature can serve. It certainly increased turnover. We got rid of a lot of people, and there's going to be a shorter tenure in office as a result. At the time term limits passed, we'd had somebody in the Senate who was there for over 50 years. He was there in 1938 and was finally termed out by Prop 140. But, he would have been elected until he died. One legislator, said that the California Senate is the geriatric ward of California. And so there were a lot of people who had been there for decades. And so there was a sense that we needed to clean house. And the positives of term limits are pretty clear in California. When you compare it to Congress, which has a very high median age, with a lot of people who, are maybe a little out of touch, and maybe don't understand technology, and maybe, I'm not sure if they understand, privacy rights, and how technology has really changed that whole debate. In California, we have an increased number of minorities and women. We have an increased election of younger candidates. We have a diversity of professions, farmers and doctors and teachers. So when we're debating water, we've got farmers who really know what the problems of water are. When we're talking about healthcare, we've got, ER doctors there. When we're talking about education, we've got teachers who have served in the classroom. Sharon Quirk Silva is an example. She was, a teacher in elementary school for 30 years. So I think that that's important to, say that we're not going to demonize term limits, but the experiment in California has had major problems. But part of that is not term limits per se, but how incredibly short the term limits have been. Because when you're talking about 6 years, you barely get into office. You're elected and you kind of look around and figure out where the bathrooms are, and suddenly you're running for re-election. You win re-election, you're sort of settling in year 3 and 4, and you know that the next election is your last. It goes really fast, and there are some pretty negative consequences to that. California Senate, you win one term, well, if you run for re-election, you're done, and now you're sort of the first day of your second term, you're done. The clock is ticking. So the shortness of the terms, I think, had a bigger impact than term limits itself. But there were certainly unintended consequences. And in California, we see these. We'll go over them in the next module in much more detail. But just to kind of give you an idea, we lose all that institutional memory. I sort of make fun of the guy who was there for 52 years, but when you wanted to know something, you go to the guy who's been there and says, yes, we tried, to change, water distribution. And we did it in 1970 and we did it in 1982 and he knows because he's been there the whole time. And so that institutional memory is really crucial. Inexperienced newcomers with a high learning curve. We had a third of the assembly who was brand new every term, a half of the Senate that was brand new every term, and dealing with a complicated budget and just a really complex state when you think about, you're a city council member from Fullerton and you go to Sacramento and suddenly you look at this huge state and you go, I don't know anything about Humboldt and I don't know anything about Redding and I don't know anything about fisheries or logging or the Bay Area or the Central Valley or the mountain regions, Los Angeles and the urban regions, the Inland Empire. Suddenly you're faced with this entire state and you don't have a lot of time to become an expert on it. One of the biggest criticisms is that it empowered lobbyists and bureaucrats. The people who were working, staffers, had a lot more power, and lobbyists had a lot more power because they actually had been in the room 52 years ago. There's the problem of looking for the next job. You've got to, you're unlikely to go back to being a farmer after you have been a politician. And so, a lot of musical chairs for seats as you're looking for the next job or, what are you going to do next? It really reduced bipartisanship, and compromise because people were there for such short times. They didn't have a chance to build relationships. Leadership, you had to be chosen right after you got elected. And so we had really, really green new leaders in the speakership and the president pro tem, and none of them were able to amass any power during that period. So it really had an impact on the term limits, and we'll go through them individually.